In November 1917, Britain reshaped the Middle East with a paragraph shorter than a postcard. A wartime letter, splashed across front pages and sharpened by careful ambiguity, backed a national home for the Jewish people in a land Britain did not control. It was World War I's version of policy by press release, a headline engineered to move allies before armies. Why risk imperial prestige on just 67 words? How did what it said and what it refused to say fuel decades of diplomacy, migration, and revolt? This is not just about what the Balfour Declaration said, it is about what it refused to say. This is Armchair Archaeology. Today, we open the drafting room door, map the secret deals and front-page reactions, and show how a single silence bent law and lives from courtrooms to city streets. Stay to the end. We will reveal the absent word and why its silence echoed louder than any promise. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe to Armchair Archaeology. It helps more curious minds find these hidden hinges of history.
Start with the document.
On November 2nd, 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a brief letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leader in British Jewish circles. It stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and added that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The phrasing fit on a single column, yet it carried outsized expectations about the future. 9 days later, newspapers printed the text. Readers met the policy as a headline before any committee could explain it. Editors knew a small letter that named a people and a place would travel fast, and the Times ran the text because it was news with diplomatic weight. Sermons echoed it, speeches quoted it, and clubs and synagogues clipped it for notice boards. The letter had been addressed to one household, but the audience broadened by the hour. Context made the headline feel larger. Britain guarded the Suez Canal and watched the Ottoman front with uncertainty. Palestine was still under Ottoman control, and British troops would not enter Jerusalem until December. That gap between printed promise and military position mattered. It told readers that ideas could move ahead of armies, and it suggested that London was trying to shape the peace while the war still raged. The document also named people whose roles mattered to viewers. Balfour signed his name. Rothschild received the letter as a public figure in British Jewish life. Chaim Weizmann, already known in political circles, had argued for recognition and now saw the central phrase appear in print. Their presence made the promise feel anchored in institutions, not rumor. Here is the tension. Britain did not control Palestine when it announced this support. Here is the resolution. Vagueness in a few key places gave the government room to maneuver. And here is the hint of what is to come. A famously short passage carried a consequential omission, one that would frame arguments long after the ink dried.
Set the scene in 1917. Palestine sat inside the Ottoman Empire, a German ally, while Britain guarded the Suez Canal, its route to India. General Allenby was pushing north from Sinai, but victory was not certain. In March, the Russian Tsar fell, and by November, the Bolsheviks were moving to pull Russia out of the war. In April, the United States had joined, yet American commitment and public opinion were still forming. London needed momentum, partners, and a message that could move faster than the front lines. Yet the war tugged in opposite directions. The Arab revolt, encouraged by British agents, promised independence across Ottoman Arab lands. The French, through Sykes and Picot, had negotiated their own sphere in Syria, with an international scheme sketched for Palestine. Evangelical currents in Britain overlapped with strategic planners who saw biblical geography and imperial logistics pointing to the same place, but each constituency wanted different assurances. In that tangle, a concise pledge could do several jobs at once. Endorsing a national home might rally parts of American opinion, steady support among British voters, and signal to a fluid Russian audience. It could also position Britain for authority in Palestine if the Ottomans collapsed, and edge ahead of French claims by placing a British-shaped commitment on the record before peace maps were finalized. Think of it as a wartime headline placed to shape the peace that followed. Too much precision could bind Britain to outcomes it could not deliver. Too much vagueness risked irrelevance. So the language was calibrated to read as moral support, as wartime propaganda, and as a claim for future stewardship, depending on who read it and where. That is why every verb and preposition bore weight. When publication came, the text traveled to Washington, Petrograd, Paris, and Cairo, collecting endorsements and objections. It prepared legal and political ground that armies later occupied. In a war of attrition, words were tools that needed no ammunition, shifting calculations in capitals long before front lines moved. When you step back and realize how a few sentences reshaped an entire century, it makes you think about how power hides in small things. That's why we made the Ancient Secrets mug, a small ritual for quiet thinking, the kind of object that reminds you how meaning rests in details. You'll find it in the pinned comment if you'd like one at your desk while we keep uncovering stories like this.
Inside Whitehall, the tidy paragraph was version control on paper. A small circle shaped the phrasing and treated each revision like a lever. Arthur Balfour would sign, but Prime Minister David Lloyd George drove policy and timing. Chaim Weizmann pushed for wording that recognized Jewish nationhood in terms the Allies could accept. Nahum Sokolov managed Paris and Rome, where sympathy and caution mixed. Mark Sykes ferried proposals through the cabinet system and compared options across desks. Lord Milner and Leo Amory tuned verbs and prepositions to survive Parliament and the peace talks. Herbert Samuel circulated a memorandum that imagined British stewardship of a Jewish center in Palestine as a practical route. The risk sat inside the grammar. Stronger verbs could read like enforceable commitments. Early drafts tried bolder language, speaking of the reconstitution of Palestine as the national home and leaning toward a future that some would hear as statehood. French sensitivities, Arab expectations, and British caution made that too heavy to carry. So the next versions stepped back from sovereignty without abandoning support. The editors settled on a pair of tools. First, a term with moral force but no fixed legal meaning. The phrase national home could be endorsed by leaders who disagreed on what it would eventually become. Second, a promise of effort that stopped short of a guarantee. Best endeavors sounded active and responsible while keeping outcomes open. Both choices could be defended in a hearing room and read with hope on a front page. Small words did quiet work. In Palestine, not of Palestine, pointed to building institutions in a place rather than asserting title over the place. Parallel clauses named civil and religious rights for existing non-Jewish communities, but left political rights undefined. Another sentence reassured Jews elsewhere that their status would not be altered by events in Palestine. Read the final lines closely and the seams show through. Earlier nouns were softened. Potential triggers were filed down. Elasticity was not an accident of haste, it was a design choice that allowed the text to travel across audiences, and that would shape every later argument about what the promise required.
Before the Balfour text went public, Britain was already writing to other audiences. In 1915 and 1916, Sir Henry McMahon exchanged letters with Sharif Hussein of Mecca to encourage an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. McMahon signaled support for an independent Arab state across most Arab lands, while carving out an exception described as the portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo. On a clean map, that line looks tidy. On the ground, it was elastic. Did the carve-out include Palestine or not? Hussein read it one way, London lawyers another. At the same time, Britain struck a private bargain with France. In May 1916, Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot sketched zones of influence on a wartime map. France would have priority in Syria and Lebanon, Britain in Mesopotamia, and Palestine was marked for an international administration to be defined later. It was a neat solution for two empires that expected victory, not for the people whose towns and fields filled those zones. Layer these texts and the conflict becomes visible. The Hussein-McMahon correspondence suggested a broad Arab future that many believed included Palestine. Sykes-Picot reserved a French role in Syria and treated Palestine as a special space. Balfour then endorsed a Jewish national home in that same space. 3 documents, 3 different trajectories, all written within 2 years. In modern terms, these were overlapping memoranda that did not agree on the deliverables. Then the privacy vanished. After the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, they published Tsarist archives. Newspapers printed the secret Sykes-Picot map just days after Balfour became public. Arab leaders and readers could now hold both stories at once, an independence pledge on one page and a carve-up on the next. British officials argued that careful phrasing kept the promises consistent. Public opinion saw collision more than harmony. If you lived in Jaffa in 1917, which promise would you trust? The headline or the leak? From that moment, every delegation and petition drew lines back to the same trio of texts. A boundary in one letter, a sphere in another, a national home in a third. The paperwork did not align, and people began to organize around the version they believed was real.
If that overlap surprised you, you can fuel more deep dives with a super thanks. It keeps this kind of careful research going. News outran armies. On November 9, 1917, British newspapers printed the Balfour text, and Zionist leaders in London and Paris treated it as a long-sought breakthrough. Chaim Weissman read validation for years of lobbying. Nahum Sokolov saw new doors open in European capitals. In synagogues from Manchester to New York, sermons shifted from memory to possibility, and the phrase national home moved from meeting minutes to pulpits and front pages. Yet, in Palestine, most people met the promise as a headline rather than a negotiation. The Ottoman administration still held Jerusalem in November 1917, and British troops would not enter the city until December. Arabic papers and rumors carried the news into Jaffa, Nablus, and Jerusalem with worry and debate. Local notables gathered petitions and held town meetings that soon coalesced into Muslim-Christian associations, early civic committees that argued Britain had no right to pledge their political future. Elsewhere, official reactions split by interest. The War Cabinet treated the letter as policy guidance. Paris endorsed it to keep faith with allies. In Washington, officials watched with interest, but kept formal commitments vague. The Vatican signaled concern for holy places and the standing of Christian communities. The same 67 words produced different readings because each audience brought its own priorities to the page. Within Arab leadership, views were not uniform. Some hoped British victory would end Ottoman neglect, yet warned against foreign domination. Others saw the declaration as a direct threat to majority rights and mobilized accordingly. In Damascus and Mecca, correspondents tried to square independence claims with the new vocabulary of national home. By 1919, these early impressions became agendas at the peace table. Emir Faisal's circle and Zionist representatives explored conditional cooperation in the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement, linking Arab statehood in Syria to Jewish national development in Palestine if broader terms were met.
At the same time, Muslim Christian associations sent petitions rejecting Balfour outright. A single paragraph had already split into rival roadmaps, each with signatures, stamps, and supporters. It felt like a modern news cycle, where a headline starts policy and the fine print struggles to catch up.
Turning a headline into governance took choreography. At San Remo in April 1920, Allied leaders assigned Britain the mandate for Palestine, with instructions to carry the Balfour wording into effect. In July 1922, the League of Nations approved the mandate text. Its preamble repeated the core phrases and translated them into tasks. Britain was to facilitate Jewish immigration, meaning active help rather than mere permission, and to encourage close settlement, meaning concentrated agricultural communities. It would also work with a recognized public body that soon took shape as the Jewish Agency. Administration compresses ambiguity. A letter can be elastic. A mandate needs forms, offices, and rules. The document listed safeguards for the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, but it did not define political power for any group. Legal advisors in London called this continuity with the 1917 phrasing. Many Arab leaders read the omission as a warning about representation and sovereignty. Implementation created a paper trail. Stamps, certificates, and budget lines turned phrasing into practice. Immigration quotas, land transfer regulations, and corporate charters for schools, clinics, and cooperatives were justified as steps required by the mandate. Disputes moved to Geneva, where the Permanent Mandates Commission, the League's oversight committee, questioned British officials about what facilitate close settlement and safeguards required in practice. Article 25, a short, consequential clause, allowed Britain to administer territory east of the Jordan separately, opening the way for Transjordan to follow different rules. That small clause opened the door to a different rule book east of the Jordan. A brief letter had effectively turned into the operating manual. Police orders, immigration certificates, and budget lines all quoted the same sentences. The text's silences became operational choices. Should immigration follow economic capacity or demographic balance? Did cooperation with the Jewish Agency mean consultation or shared authority? Could civil and religious protections hold if political rights were undefined? Over time, the vocabulary hardened into precedent. What began as wartime phrasing sat behind desks in Jerusalem and London, directing how people moved, built, and argued. The mandate did not resolve tensions embedded in the 1917 letter. It preserved them as policy and supplied the stamps to enforce them.
Policy turned into people. After 1919, Jewish immigration arrived in numbered waves, with British certificates that treated the mandate as instruction. Newcomers joined farm collectives and expanding towns, while the Yishuv built schools, clinics, cooperatives, and a labor federation that promoted Hebrew labor. After violence in 1920 and 1921, local self-defense coalesced into the Haganah. It coordinated with elected bodies that imagined themselves as scaffolding for a national home. Growth on paper meant pressure in neighborhoods. Many large estates were owned by absentee landlords in Beirut or Damascus. When deeds changed hands, tenant farmers faced eviction under rules they did not write. Hiring patterns shifted as new industries took hold. Jaffa and Jerusalem felt the strain first, where docks, markets, and housing were already tight. A citrus boom pulled capital and workers to the coast, while hill villages watched customary use turn into fenced parcels and stamped deeds. It resembled a modern city, where permits, visas, and zoning shaped daily choices more than any speech. Two snapshots to scale the change. Numbers set the tempo. In 1922, about 84,000 Jews lived among roughly 757,000 people. By 1931, the Jewish population reached about 175,000, in a total just over 1 million. Figures that looked modest in distant offices felt transformative in streets, where jobs, rents, and fields were finite. Municipal politics and union rules began to mirror the new arithmetic. Officials tried to keep pace. Land ordinances, immigration categories, and policing plans aimed to reconcile incompatible expectations. Arab leadership organized through Muslim-Christian associations, and later the Supreme Muslim Council, petitioning against immigration and sales. Street politics turned volatile. The Nebi Musa disturbances in 1920 and the Jaffa riots in 1921 showed how rumor could mobilize crowds within hours. In 1929, tensions around the Western Wall escalated into violence in Jerusalem, Safed, and Hebron, where long-settled Jewish communities suffered deadly attacks.
By the early 1930s, the mandate was not a distant legal text. It lived in permits, plots, and patrols. Each certificate could be read as progress by one community and displacement by another. The quiet lesson was simple. Fine print moves lines on the ground.
London tried to convert flexible words into workable rules. In 1922, the Churchill White Paper said national home did not mean turning all of Palestine into a Jewish state. It tied immigration to the country's economic capacity and reassured Arab leaders that the majority was not meant to be displaced. At the same time, it affirmed cooperation with the Jewish Agency and continued immigration. Balance on paper did not equal calm on the street. After the 1929 violence, the Passfield White Paper of 1930 warned of the effects of immigration and land purchase and urged tighter controls, with attention to Arab labor conditions. Zionist leaders protested. In early 1931, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald sent a private letter to Chaim Weizmann that softened Passfield without rescinding it. Public policy acquired a private annotation, the kind of tweak modern viewers recognize from software patch notes that change behavior without changing the version number. Improvisation followed. Immigration climbed as refugees fled Europe. Land rules were adjusted by ordinance and exception. Yet constitutional reform for the Arab majority stalled. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 forced a reckoning that commissions had avoided. The Peel Commission in 1937 proposed partition, arguing that two national projects could not be reconciled inside one political frame. Arabs rejected the plan. Zionists debated it, many treating it as recognition of realities on the ground. War drew closer and the cabinet changed course. The 1939 White Paper capped Jewish immigration at 75,000 over 5 years, restricted land sales in most districts, and promised an independent Palestine within 10 years with shared power. Any further immigration after the quota would require Arab consent. Zionist institutions called it a reversal of the mandate's spirit. Arab leaders doubted the timetable and condemned continued immigration in the interim. By 1939, ambiguity had become an operating method. Each white paper translated the phrase national home into quotas, districts, and police orders. Each adjustment calmed one crisis while setting up the next. When public policy collided with reality, London usually tried to repair it in letters and committees rather than by rewriting the original promise.
Drop your thoughts below. If you could rewrite one phrase in the Declaration to change its impact, which would it be?
The fiercest arguments moved from streets to hearing rooms. From the 1920s onward, lawyers, diplomats, and petitioners treated phrases like national home and civil and religious rights as if they were statutes. In Geneva, the Permanent Mandates Commission, the League's Oversight Committee, pressed British officials to define facilitate, meaning active help, and close settlement, meaning concentrated agricultural communities. In London, advisors insisted the mandate required efforts, not a specific constitutional outcome. Meanings collided in predictable ways. Zionist representatives said national home implied building institutions that could mature into self-government. Arab petitioners replied that the mandate acknowledged a large non-Jewish majority whose collective political rights were left unnamed but could not be ignored. Each side pointed to the same preamble and traced a different destination.
Committees drafted memoranda on whether policy should secure equality of opportunity, the same doors open to all, or equality of outcome, comparable representation regardless of numbers. Debate turned on small hinges. Was in Palestine different from of Palestine? Did facilitate require active promotion or careful allowance? Could civil and religious rights be protected if political rights were undefined? British replies leaned on administrative flexibility. Critics saw elastic words justifying firm actions. Court cases over land transfers and citizenship, and rulings on school language and municipal charters slowly accumulated around the same vocabulary, turning sentences into precedents. Texts shape reality through what they include and through what they omit. The mandate reproduced the Declaration's key terms, yet never defined sovereignty for anyone. That absence set the frame for every argument that followed. When commissions asked if majority will should determine institutions, British witnesses answered that the document had no such instruction. When petitioners demanded parity in councils, officials replied that the mandate guaranteed protections of rights, not allocations of power. For modern viewers, this feels like today's disputes over the verbs in a UN resolution, where urge and decide can alter events without changing line length. In the courtroom of the mandate, history advanced by commas, prepositions, and careful silences. Each year of paperwork hardened those readings into practice.
Laws spoke in clauses, but identities rallied around places and objects. Under the mandate, the Department of Antiquities issued permits, set guardrails for digs, and filled galleries where the public could walk a timeline in glass cases. Excavation became a civic event. At the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, visitors moved from prehistoric tools to medieval inscriptions, and the sequence itself began to feel like a claim. Labels turned facts into stories, and stories into maps people carried in their heads. Fieldwork did more than recover the past. A seal with ancient Hebrew script near a biblical site, a Quranic lintel reused in an Ottoman wall, or a Roman street uncovered beneath a market, each supplied a portable narrative. Guides, pamphlets, and schoolbooks braided finds into lessons about continuity and belonging. Even place names on maps mattered. Choosing one name over another could make one century vivid and let a neighbor's century fade. Institutions understood the power of these choices. Zionist bodies funded excavations at sites like Megiddo and Lachish, pairing language revival with landscapes of ancestors. Arab scholars and clerics curated their own timelines, emphasizing early Islamic foundations, detailed Waqf records, and Ottoman urban life as evidence of deep roots. The Supreme Muslim Council invested in renovations and stewardship at the Haram al-Sharif, while committees argued over conservation near the Western Wall. Museums became policy rooms with glass walls. Foreign schools competed for permits and publications, tilting attention toward periods they specialized in. The effect reached beyond galleries. Tour paths, restoration projects, and souvenir photos shaped how distant audiences pictured the land. A postcard from a dig or a newsreel of a conservation ceremony could legitimize a claim as surely as a speech. That is the part modern viewers will recognize. Heritage became a form of soft power. A museum label could travel far before the word existed, and a televised unveiling could move opinion faster than a policy paper. By the end of the mandate era, archaeology, memory, and politics had fused. The past was not only excavated, it was staged for competing publics, and each shard or inscription could tip an argument beyond the trench where it was found.
We began with a paragraph shorter than a postcard and watched its wording set expectations from London to Jerusalem. Across drafts, councils, white papers, and petitions, one pattern stayed constant. The Declaration endorsed a national home, paired it with civil and religious safeguards for non-Jewish communities, and affirmed the political status of Jews elsewhere. It coordinated allies, shaped the mandate's rulebook, and filtered into immigration lists, land deeds, court cases, and museum labels. The fiercest debates clustered not only around what it said, but around what it left unsaid. The Declaration never used the word state,
By avoiding a term that signaled sovereignty and majority rule, British policymakers kept room to maneuver. They could promise facilitation without promising independence, and protect communal rights without allocating political power. That omission did not end the argument. It framed every argument that followed. Modern viewers know this pattern well. In law, diplomacy, and even terms of service, a single missing word can redirect outcomes more than a paragraph of prose. The Balfour Declaration became both a key and a question. It unlocked momentum in 1917, then set the terms of dispute for decades. A few lines on London letterhead traveled into lives, not only through what they declared, but through what they withheld. If this changed how you read the Balfour Declaration, drop a comment with the one phrase you think carries the most weight, and why. Do you think a single absent word should shape a century of policy? Tell us below. If you enjoyed this, hit like, subscribe to Armchair Archaeology, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. Share this with someone who loves history that hinges on precise wording. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, what is not written can be as powerful as what is written.